Hi, and welcome to Gender. Now we're going to look at gendered nonverbal communication. So last week we looked at the gendered verbal communication. This week we're going to explore gendered nonverbal communication. Now nonverbal communication, this is an important component because we often misunderstand what nonverbal is entirely. We get most of it, but not all of it. So when we're looking at this, the elements of communication other than words. Now there's a trick to that. Now this can include voice speed or tones. Now there's part of the trick. It's not the language, but the tones or the speed in which, or the cadence in which we speak is nonverbal. Facial movements, body movements, the use of space, how we use the space. I'm in my office and studio here, and how I have it decorated, if you will, or what things I have placed for people and myself to see, the books that I have, the pictures that I might have up my desk and things are all representative of my space. And that's nonverbal. Space also relates to the space between us, how close we are, how far apart we are all parts of nonverbal communication. So scholars state, now that could represent a number, but there's been a lot of work on nonverbal. But they say the majority of our communication, anywhere between 65 to 93%, that depends on which scholars' research you look at, but clearly more than half, depending upon the scholar, half of the majority of our meaning comes from nonverbal behavior. So language, verbal communication, only accounts for less than half of the meaning that we derive from each other's words. The nonverbal takes up, we get more out of the nonverbal, and yet how conscious are we of our nonverbal communication? So like language, nonverbal communication is also related to culture and gender. Nonverbal communication conveys cultural meaning of gender for both men and women, and use of nonverbal communication to express themselves as gendered. So this week we're going to consider what function nonverbal communication plays in conveying messages, communicating to one another. So let's get started. So the function of nonverbal communication is we're going to look at some of the functions of nonverbal. There are purposes, there are things we use nonverbal for, and there's groups of about 5 things. Supplements. The function of nonverbal communication supplement verbal communication, and nonverbal supplements and adds to or verbal messages. We're going to look at 5 different ones. So one of the first is repeating words. Now, we don't have to repeat. I can remember with my daughter, if I asked her to pick something up, I would point. Could you please pick that up? If I needed to repeat, I didn't need to say those words again. I just needed to look and point again. So the pointing, or a head nodding up and down while saying yes, or saying right and using my right hand to point right. These are repeating. So the nonverbal can be used to repeat words without having to say them again. One of the things I used to express to parents when I was a behavior consultant is, one, make your words meaningful, but make your words important enough that that's what they listen to. So if you're parenting, it's better to use a lot more of the nonverbal communication that you can, where you can use your words to positively reinforce. Thank you, Kate, for bringing that to me and picking that up off the floor. Now my words are reinforcing and she wants to hear them. If all I'm doing is, will you pick that up and stop doing that, then I'm probably communicating verbally in a way that my child will start to tune me out. So using nonverbal is a great way to offset what we do verbally. All right, so that's one, repeating words. Contradicting verbal messages. Now this is one we probably do an awful lot more than we think, and it we'll come back to it later in this chapter, explain some of the discord or the misunderstandings that we have in communicating. Contradicting, this would be the example, and I've seen this quite a bit. Maybe you've participated, and someone sees you're not doing well. Maybe they see a tear in your eye and your head is down and you're sobbing a bit, and someone comes up and says, "Hey, are you all right?" And you say, "Fine." Well, how can you be fine? So it's that contradicting. So sometimes our verbal, nonverbal can be very contradicting. Do you agree with me? And you go, well, my face sort of said no, or I was skeptical, but my head was nodding. Or I could have said yeah, and gone, yeah. Well, my head said no, but my words said yes. So that contradicting can be one of the sources or misunderstandings that we might have. Now, the third is complementing. That sometimes some of our nonverbal complements what our verbals are. Clapping our hands and smiling while declaring excitement, or sealing, like I threaten somebody in some manner and I use a forceful glare to support that. It's complementary. So this is where our verbal and our nonverbal are in line. They support, they're complementary. Fourth, I can use it as a way of replacing language. So as you said something that I find rather disgusting, or I don't agree with, I can roll my eyes. So I didn't have to say anything, you quite understood. Or if you asked me a question and I shrugged my shoulders, I didn't need to say I don't know. And so sometimes our nonverbal behavior replaces our verbal behavior. And then 5, accenting verbal messages by emphasizing certain words. And this is where we start to emphasize or start to explore the nonverbal communication that involves our voice volume, for example, or gesturing with certain emphasis, So accenting or emphasizing, as I did there, is a one way to emphasize, and I then tried to emphasizing with my voice volume, not with another word, same word. So it's accenting. So those are all, I want to restate that's different ways in which we can regulate. Now the second one is, can you use nonverbal to communicate to regulate interactions? We can also use our nonverbal that way, either through our eye contact, body posture, and vocal inflections. Others who, when we want to speak or when we want them to speak, we can use our eye contact and body postures to help facilitate that. Women tend to use cues to invite and encourage others into conversations. Men tend to use more cues for maintaining attention and discouraging others from speaking, such as avoiding eye contact. So 3 is to establish the relationship level of meaning. So we use our nonverbal communication as a way of establishing our relationship level. And this is important because we have more than one level of relationship. There are 3 primary dimensions of relationship level meaning. There's responsiveness, liking, and power. Now we're going to look at each one, but first we'll look at responsiveness. And responsiveness is defined as interest in the interaction and involvement of others. Now this can include nonverbal cues indicating responsiveness, like inflection. Now inflection would be when we speak and we have this sort of jaunty, bounty, I'm really happy about being, so you get this sort of, that's responsive. It's not quite like this where it's not very responsive. So responsiveness, where we use these inflections in our voice. There's tends to be communicating with others. Women tend to do this more than men do. Responsiveness differs by culture. Liking, now this is demonstrated through nonverbal cues such as vocal warmth, sitting close to another, touching, holding eye contact. Now that doesn't mean staring into each other's eyes, but holding eye contact when you're communicating shows degree of liking. Girls and women tend to be socialized to be more strongly than boys, and men tend to communicate liking because they are socialized to be nice to others and build relationships. Dislike is communicated non-verbally as well, through frowns, glares, or just turning away, turning your eyes away, turning your body away. And the third part of that would be power and control, power or control, that is. And it's the extent in which people are seen as equal to or dominant over or differential to others. Now, the three primary ways we communicate power are through our voice, touch, and the use of space. Men tend to talk louder and with more inflection than women when it comes to power. They tend to take up more space and touch people more to communicate their status. It's interesting, there's a midline. If you look at your spinal cord down your back, that's a midline. And if someone were to come up to you and touch you on the near shoulder, we would take one form of message from that than if I had reached around your back and put my hand around you that way. That says something entirely different. Without my having said a word, my use of space and touch can communicate two different messages. This essentially gets to where we can see that nonverbal communication can and does function to communicate gender similarities and differences. We can now look at forms of non-communication, what forms nonverbal communication take. Now, many of these you're going to be familiar with. However, we often don't consider our own nonverbal communication in the moment, as it is so much part of our own communication style and almost something we do so unconsciously. And I don't mean that we're unconscious of what we do nonverbally, but we don't think about it in formulating our thoughts as much as we do about what words will we use. And so these other forms of nonverbal communication might get you to think about, well, what am I expressing in the way that I dress, or the way that I decorate my house, or how close that I stand, or how far away I stand from other people. So let's look at forms of nonverbal communication. We'll start with artifacts. Artifacts are personal objects that express our identity and how we view ourselves. Now, these can include colors, types of toys that demonstrate appropriate behaviors and activities for boys and girls. For example, building sets for boys and dolls for girls. Even if you get a building set for girls, it's oftentimes pink or in some other color that represents one gender or another. Also, clothing. These are our artifacts. So clothing is another type of artifact. While less strict than in the past generations, still defines women and men differently. Men's clothing tend to be less colorful and allow for easy movement, whereas women's clothing tends to call attention to their bodies with form-fitting styles and clinging materials. Selecting clothing is particularly challenging for trans and gender non-conforming people, as much of our clothing choices are still very much binary. Advertising emphasizes what articles men or women are supposed to use. Even so, some people use artifacts to challenge cultural prescriptions of masculinity and femininity. And this is where we start to explore gender fluidity again. The second one is known as proxemics and the use of personal space, and it refers to how people use distance and space. Now, proxemics refers to how people use space, including the distance they keep from one another when they are spending time together. Norms about proximity are culturally constructed. Our culture about how close to stand to have a conversation with people you call your friends is different than in other cultures. Space between people, either how close you are or how far away, varies from culture to culture. Space is an index of power and a primary way to designate who is important and privileged. Other ways space is used can include who sits at the head of the table. Think of your own family, and when you sat down for dinners, did everybody have a seat, and how was that organized? You know, oftentimes what mothers' and fathers' spaces look like within households will be different. In this form, we can include territoriality. Now, territoriality is your personal space, but not everyone's territory is equally respected. People with more power have more control over who uses, the space. Men are more likely to go into women's spaces than women are to go into men's spaces. You think of your boss, and at work, you know that your boss can go into your area, but are you quite as open and allowed to go into the boss's area? Or if you don't know and you go in, do you feel comfortable and at ease, or do you feel like somehow you shouldn't be here? That's the degree in which space can have an impact on us, and that's culturally defined. 3 is haptics. Now, haptics is a sort of a clinical word that is used to describe touch, and the use of touch from parents and adults to communicate different messages to boys and girls. Parents tend to touch daughters more and often more gently than they touch their sons, which teaches girls to expect touching from others. Boys are more likely to learn to associate touch with control and power. Females are more likely to initiate touches to express support, affection, and comfort, while men associate touch with control and power. Men are also more likely than women to use forceful touch, and many men are unaware of how strong they are, which, that's not an excuse. It's just an awareness that sometimes in those situations they aren't aware, and more men certainly are aware that they have more strength than most of women that they associate with, so they could use that force. 4, kinesics are the facial and body motions that we participate in. Feminine kinestic behaviors include tilting of heads, smiling, and condensing their bodies to take up less space, the way that they sit more cross-legged more often and arms close to their bodies. Masculine kinetic behaviors include using large gestures, taking up space. I think it was explained in many articles around mansplaining, how it is that men understand women's issues, but they do so. The man-spreading was about how much space men take up on subways, for example. Using large gestures, taking up space, and entering others' territories. Women tend to make more eye contact during conversations than men do to signal interest and involvement. A 5th form, paralanguage, refers to vocal cues that accompany verbal communication, such as inflection, tone, volume, accent, pitch, and rhythm. Now that's quite a collection of nonverbal attributes that we can put to verbal language, and how we use inflection, tone, volume, accents, pitch, and rhythm. Male and female physiology doesn't fully explain the difference in pitch that's used between men and women. Men tend to use a lower pitch, higher volume, and less inflection to gain and hold attention. Women tend to use a softer pitch, lower volume, and more inflection to appear polite and caring. These are socialized behaviors and not entirely a result of physiological differences. And that's important. Part of what we're trying to communicate here is how much culture affects gender. And so even though physiologically there aren't enough differences to explain the different uses of, in this case, paralanguage, it shows how much is taught to us about how to express to one another. So, carrying on, some polls indicate men are generally satisfied with their appearance and are less likely to connect appearance to their overall competence and value. However, as our culture increasingly emphasizes men's bodies, more men are attempting to gain idealized muscularity for masculinity through working out, weightlifting, even the use of steroids. Gay men are more likely to attach physical appearance to self-worth. Girls and women are more likely than men to feel pressure to look good all the time. For girls and women, concerned about weight starts early. By grade 3, 50 to 80% of girls say they want to lose weight. Grade 3. That's cultural. The commercials in the media that even in grade 3 you are exposed to. Look at the messages that girls are getting at such a young age. Women make up between 85 and 95% of the people with eating disorders. Dissatisfaction with body size, particularly for Caucasian women, influences overall self-esteem. Now, in general, African American women, particularly those strongly identified with their ethnic heritages, tend to be more satisfied with their bodies and less prone to eating disorders. again, has more of a cultural connotation. Not every culture attributes the same qualities to masculinity and femininity. Body size is not universal across all the world. There is also differences between men and women's skills for interpreting nonverbal behavior. Generally, females are better able to decode nonverbal behaviors and more accurately perceives others' emotions. Now, largely, if you remember when we talked biology and looking at some of the biological differences, the corpus callosum, that band that joins the two sides of the brains is more dense and more used by women, so that could explain why women are better able to decode nonverbal behavior. However, men are noticeably faster at recognizing angry facial cues, which, given cultural norms, that maybe isn't too surprising. Now, various theories offer explanations for this strong ability to read feelings. Biological theories posit that it's the result of the sex-related brain differences. Again, part of that is the corpus callosum. Cognitive development and social learning theories state that females are encouraged to be sensitive to others and to the relationships at a very young age. They start that very young. Standpoint theory suggests women's ability to decode results from their standing as subordinate members in society. And in order to get a handle, that's what standpoint theory is about. So, respecting gendered styles of nonverbal behavior, and we're looking at this as a wrap-up, if you will. Make an effort to understand, respect, and appreciate others' nonverbal communication on their own terms. Now, what is really important is to be more reflective, I guess, of our own. By recognizing and attempting to understand others' patterns of nonverbal behavior, we may increase appreciation for individual differences and less rigidity. Restrict expectations for nonverbal behavior. Now, this might and may also provide a greater range of communication options for all of us. Interpreting others on their own terms might lead to clarification of misunderstandings and to develop communicative techniques to minimize misunderstandings. It also enhances the personal effectiveness by increasing the range of options you have when communicating with different people. And really, is there anything more we can do to ensure that we do the best with our interactions with people and our relationships, whether that be with our friends, acquaintances, strangers, family, loved ones, our own children? The more flexibility that we have in our ability to communicate effectively, both verbally and non-verbally, will enable us to communicate effectively with other people. And therefore, with our children, be better able to prepare them to be better communicators in their future, and therefore how that will affect them in their lives and the goals that they can achieve. All right. I hope this has been helpful for you. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you in the next week's video. Bye now.